Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. I'm Hervé Linder, president of the UIA Commission on Immigration Law and Nationality. And I'd like to welcome you to our mid-year meeting for this year 2021, and which has been an interesting year, as 2020 was. It will be over 2 days. The mid-year meeting will be over 2 days, today and tomorrow. Today will be a 2.5-hour meeting, and tomorrow will be a 1.5-hour meeting, with today being also reserved for the last hour for commission business and discussion among our members. So we have two themes, actually, and a main theme. So I will read the main theme to you, which is immigration rights and the COVID-19 pandemic, temporary erosion and permanent reinvention. And today, the theme will be emergency and short-term erosion of immigration rights. On the announced basis of the protection of the health and safety of their citizens, national governments prescribed many restrictive measures at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic under the general umbrella of short-term or emergency lockdown. This session will discuss such measures that restricted migration both directly, such as the suspension of certain visa categories, and indirectly, such as general curtailment of government services. Then it shall probe the interaction of these measures with the obligations of national governments from the standpoint of constitutions and international treaties. So today, for our first session, we have 4 speakers, which are from Canada, Mexico, US, and the UK. So I would like to introduce Marc-André Séguin from Montréal, who will start this session. Then we have Adrian Ojeda from Mexico. And then we have Ellen Freeman from a new member. So welcome, Ellen, to the UIA from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Matthew Wills from the UK, who's been a long-standing member of our commission as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and ask Marc-André to start his presentation on the Canada's COVID-19 measures and overview. Marc-André, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hervé, and thank you everyone for attending today. I look forward to exchanging with you on every country's experience in dealing with this once-in-a-century pandemic situation. I speak to you today from an interesting vantage point, because not only can I talk to you about the Canadian pandemic response as it pertains to immigration regulations and enforcement, but it's also because I am currently experiencing it. I write to you from an active quarantine that is imposed to me by the Canadian regulations right now. 14-day quarantine, which is mandatory to pretty much everyone upon arriving to Canada. And also while learning that during that quarantine, this particular requirement is about to be lifted for travelers, for authorized travelers, starting on July 6th. And so we are in the middle of these changes and constantly adapting. The Canadian pandemic response at the border has been probably one of the more conservative around the world, definitely alongside jurisdictions such as Hong Kong and Singapore, in the sense that it has gradually imposed more and more quarantine and restrictions at the border over the last year and a half or so. Our adventure begins in Canada in March 2020, more specifically March 18, where the Canadian government really began to implement a series of measures in an effort to slow the spread of COVID-19, particularly at the border. On March 21, 2019, the Canadian border was closed for all non-essential travel and remains closed to this day. The Canadian border is closed by land between Canada and the United States and remains closed as of today. In fact, we learned this week that the border would remain closed until July 21st. And the arrivals by air are also significantly limited. They are limited to Canadian citizens, permanent residents, as well as travelers who are deemed to be essential workers or business visitors, as well as to students who have valid study permits and can demonstrate that their physical presence is required on Canadian soil in order for them to pursue their academic program. In addition to that, family members of Canadian citizens and permanent residents are also allowed on Canadian soil for purposes of family reunification. But it's also important to know that even though you are allowed in Canada, it doesn't mean that you are exempt from quarantine requirements. In fact, quarantine requirements are pretty much imposed across the board. They consist of a 14-day period of self-isolation where you cannot leave your address. Since January of 2021, the quarantine has also been reinforced. And it asks of travelers that they self-isolate for 3 days in a government-authorized hotel. They must take a PCR test 72 hours before landing in Canada, before leaving for Canada. They must take a second PCR test at the airport upon landing. Only 3 airports in Canada are currently open to international travelers. 4 airports. Those airports require that you test immediately after being admitted into the country. And then you are required to go to a hotel for up to 3 days while you wait for the result of that PCR test. You are also given a home kit for yet a third PCR test that you can then carry with you to your your secondary place of quarantine, where you complete your quarantine after the hotel. You are authorized to leave the hotel the moment that you get your result of the PCR test that you do upon landing in Canada. And the moment that you arrive at your other place, you need to finish a 14-day quarantine. On the 8th day of that quarantine, you are also required to take the third home PCR test that you must then, and you must arrange for a courier to come and pick that up, deliver it to a lab, and you wait for your result. Even if you test negative before leaving for Canada, upon landing in Canada, and on the third, and upon receiving the third negative test, you are still required to finish the 14-day quarantine. Failure to do so could result in a minimum penalty of $3,000 per infraction, and per day of infraction could lead to a penalty of up to $750,000 as well as jail time. In addition to that, obviously there are other local measures that are added to this, including mask mandates, self-isolation upon leaving quarantine, and so forth. I forgot to mention that during quarantine, travelers are also required to check in on a daily basis using a mandatory app called ArriveCan, where every day at around 11 a.m. They are asked to confirm whether they have symptoms, COVID-related symptoms. Obviously, the restrictions at the border and on Canadian soil have caused a number of issues, to say the least. It has slowed down the possibility for family reunification, for extended family reunification. It has prevented workers from entering and freely entering and leaving the Canadian territory, and has slowed down the entry of business visitors, and has also completely halted tourism, international tourism, since March of 2020. The Canadian position with respect to this has always been that entry, apart for Canadian citizens and permanent residents, is never a right. So to the point of today's theme, Canada's position is that entry into Canada is not a right that is protected by the charters. It is always a privilege, and therefore they have regulated it as such. Over time, Canada has loosened some of its restrictions in where they authorized or facilitated family reunification for the immediate family members of Canadian citizens and permanent residents, which was not as easy at the beginning of this pandemic. The abilities for workers to enter Canada has also been slightly loosened and is now a little bit more flexible. And in addition to that, of course, immigration services have slowly started to resume activities at a more normal pace after having slowed down for several months. There were temporary changes that were made to public policy during the pandemic to accommodate particular circumstances caused by the extended border closures. For example, any individual that was in Canada as a visitor could apply for a work permit as long as they met the requirements within Canada under certain conditions. And if approved, that individual is now able to receive a work permit without having to leave the country and then re-enter. The same way, individuals who attempt to cross the border into the US and are denied entry are now allowed to come back to Canada without having to do the quarantine, which was a mandatory requirement before. And as I mentioned earlier, certain quarantine requirements will be lifted starting July 6th for fully vaccinated travelers who are already allowed to enter Canada. So again, Canadian citizens, permanent residents, authorized workers, and business visitors. We have no information to date as to when Canada will open its borders to other types of travelers. Or when the Canada-US border is expected to open. For the time being, the announcement is that that will remain closed until July 21st. We have, however, had good news from our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who this week announced that some of these measures are expected to loosen up additionally over the course of, and I'm quoting here, weeks, not months. So the picture in Canada has been, from the perspective of freedom to travel, has been bleak if we compare to our NAFTA neighbors. That being said, with the fact that Canada has now one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world, close to 70% of all of its population has received a first dose, and about 20% of the population has received both doses and is considered fully vaccinated. We can expect that the pace at which these restrictions will loosen will accelerate in the coming weeks, with a likely semi-return to normal by August or September of this year. I will leave it at that for the time being, but I'll be happy to discuss further.
Sure, Marc-Andre, as a follow-up here, what about on the processing side? See, I use my Canadian accent here on the processing side here for immigration in Canada. Were we seeing, because of staffing issues, remote work? I know on the US side, just generally across the board from a governmental standpoint, we're seeing some massive delays. I practice immigration-driven tax law, and we are, to the extent you have paper processing, we are seeing delays running to well over half a year in some instances. So can you speak to that issue here and what you've encountered?
Absolutely. There have been significant delays, and the federal authorities, in a way to address this, especially for the renewal of work permits, have been more flexible, especially in I would say the last 6 months, with a concept under Canadian law called implied status. So as long as the applicant or the work permit holder applied for renewal within acceptable timelines, they would be able to remain in status in the country while the backlog was being processed. Similarly, for permanent residency applications, we have seen a significant amount of backlogs on two sides. First of all, the first one being that of course, consular sections overseas had a significant slowdown in their activities. And locally, with the stay-at-home orders that were issued at the provincial level, staffers were also required to work from home, which significantly slowed the processing time. We can expect for certain types of permanent residency applications, for example, for the timeline to be extended by several months, if not over a year, in certain categories. The way that the Canadian authorities have addressed that is by hiring additional staff, hiring and training additional staff at the federal immigration level to help clear the backlog over time. So there is an expectation that this will be handled in the medium to long term. And in addition to that, one of the more heartbreaking situations that were faced by certain applicants was that essential travel was very closely defined from the beginning of this pandemic. And in fact, confirmed prospective permanent residents could not, up until this week, were not allowed to fly to Canada to complete their landing procedures and activate their permanent residency status, and were in fact turned down at the border when they attempted to do so. Because flying from overseas to land as a permanent resident was not deemed to be an essential motive for travel. That policy was reversed just a few days ago, which also will allow some of the permanent residents or prospective permanent residents to finally be cleared of that backlog as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I could have one quick follow-up here. So do you think that the Canadian government will be very good in terms of getting a green light when such COVID relief as implied status will end? Because one of the issues that I've been encountering is clients thinking that relief is going to last for a longer time than what it actually will. So could you address that just briefly here?
We don't, to my personal knowledge, we haven't received any clear notifications as to what direction this will take. Yeah. We've seen, however, the track record of the federal authorities right now is that they have been extremely conservative in how they approach any COVID-related policy. But at the same time have demonstrated over time some level of flexibility and humanity for these for people who find themselves in a situation where they could not redress their status related issues because of the pandemic. How long will that flexibility last? It's very hard to say at this time. But I would expect that the approach would continue to be pretty much the same that it has been, which is conservative and then flexible up to a certain point with advance notice of any expected policy changes.
There's a question in the chat box here, but Hervé, I defer to you. I think that's probably a general question we can take up after our presentations about openness. When will countries open?
Sure. Yeah. So the two, I mean, Chris has a question. When will the embargo to Canada end?
It says, when will Canada be open again?
Oh, well,
that was the follow-up.
I think the answer is within weeks, not months, right?
That was Prime Minister Trudeau has stated as early as this week. There will be a gradual, what we can expect is a gradual, very slow, gradual loosening of the border over time for fully vaccinated travelers, and the categories of people allowed into the country will start to become broader. But one thing that we can expect is, for the foreseeable future, non-Canadian or non-permanent resident or non-valid work or study permit holders coming into Canada will be required to be fully vaccinated.
Thank you. I have two quick questions. You mentioned the 3-day quarantine in an airport, in a government designated hotel, and a 14-day quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 14 plus 3 or 11 plus 3?
It's 11 plus 3. It's a total of 14 days.
Okay.
Any international traveler coming by air is required to book a 3-night stay at a government authorized hotel. Land travelers are not required to do that. They can go straight to their quarantine location and do the 14 days.
But the land borders are closed, so.
Well, they are closed with very, very few exceptions.
Okay.
But people arriving by air are required to book 3 nights. Those nights are non-refundable. The cost for the hotel varies between $1,500 to $3,000 generally. And however, the moment that the travelers do get their second negative PCR test, they are allowed to leave the hotel at that time. Unfortunately, the unused nights are non-refundable.
And my second question, thank you. And my second question is regarding the right of entry. You mentioned that it's a privilege, not a right. Does this also apply to Canadian citizens?
No, Canadian citizens and permanent residents have a constitutional right to enter the country. Anyone else, there would not be deemed to have a right, so to speak. It is always considered to be a privilege.
So the right applies also to permanent residents, the constitutional right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Marc-André?
Yeah, I have just a small one regarding, you said in the future, fully vaccinated people will be able to travel to Canada. Has Canada already a position on what kind of vaccines they recognize? Because like here in Europe, we now have these EU digital certificate which will make it easy within the Schengen area to travel. But only vaccines or vaccinated people with vaccines recognized by the European Medical Agency will have this this advantage. Does Canada have restrictions regarding vaccines?
It does. So at the moment, the only vaccines that are going to be recognized when we talk about fully vaccinated travelers, the only vaccines that are currently recognized by Canada are Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca. So any other vaccine currently has not received approval from Canadian health authorities, and therefore would not be recognized for the purposes of traveling and quarantine exemption.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions for Marc-André? All right, it's almost 10:30, so I suggest we move to our second speaker, Adrian Ojeda. So Adrian from Mexico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President Hervé. Thank you, Clayton, also for putting together this seminar, which is a good excuse for all of us to sit down, see each other again, even if we would love to do it face to face in somewhere in the world. It's still very good, and thank you for all the time that you always put in organizing these kind of events. And what I like about UIA and the activities that you have been coordinating for us is that you force us out of our corporate immigration bubble and invite us to question from a human rights perspective, this constitutional perspective, the regulation that has been implemented and that we are surfing every day, but that sometimes in the day-to-day, we never stop to really question ourselves whether all these that we are experiencing is aligned with the constitution of our countries and the human rights that have been recognized by most countries or almost all countries in the world. So thank you again, and thank you for everybody that is here joining us. It will be very, very interesting to do this as interactive as Zoom allows us to do it. And I think that the order that you chose, Hervé and Clayton, is great. After listening to Canada as one of the most conservative countries in the approach towards the pandemic. As you know, Mexico once again is leading the pack of those countries favoring mobility, with close to no restrictions to travel to Mexico during the pandemic. It was not implemented last year, and I seriously doubt that at this point it will be implemented at all. So I think we will make history, for good or for bad, history will tell, as one of the countries with less restrictions to travel to Mexico during the pandemic. This is good news for all travelers. Of course, having no restrictions cause less tension in regards to human rights protection, constitutional issues. However, the numbers are still there, and those numbers are very cold and very, very obvious, as we are one of the countries with more deaths caused by COVID, over 230,000 official ones. And there are many, many unofficials that have not been reported to the government, or that the government is somehow not reporting them as caused by coronavirus. So, but that's from a health perspective. From an immigration perspective, as you know, there is no requirement for quarantine, no testing. Many times, no questions are asked for travelers coming into Mexico. No countries with restrictions, no matter how bad the situations are in that country in regards to coronavirus. There are no limits or restrictions to any country. Once you are in Mexico, no mandatory lockdowns. They were all voluntary lockdowns. The government launched this campaign suggesting that you stay at home, but no mandatory lockdown in any city. Very few of them with mandatory use of mask. No restriction whatsoever to travel inside Mexico from one city to another city, from one state to another city. So basically, as a summary, the only, I would say, two restrictions, which is actually limited to one, that was implemented as a consequence of coronavirus, as a consequence of the pandemic, are those travel restrictions for essential activities in the northern border and in the southern border. Many of you know this. The U.S. is actually enforcing this non-essential restriction from Mexico, and what we just heard from Canada too, into the United States. However, even though in the news it appears as if it was a bilateral agreement, the truth is that Mexico is not restricting any travel from the United States to Mexico, even by car or by walking through the border. This restriction only applies from Mexico to the United States. But you know, diplomatics, it would not look good that the United States would just impose that the restriction. We need to make it appear as if it was an agreement between the two countries. So even though from a regulation point of view, it does exist, in reality, it is not being enforced on the Mexican side. Now in the southern border, it's a different story. It is being enforced, that restriction of essential traveling, but this is my personal opinion. I think that this was just an excuse to restrict the entrance of undocumented travelers, or those famous caravans. So it gave President López Obrador a good excuse to force or to tighten the limitation of Central Americans under the umbrella or with excuse of the coronavirus, which, as we all know, was forced by former President Trump in the United States. So that's the only restriction. And again, I seriously question whether it was implemented for health reasons. So that's the situation. As you can hear, almost no restrictions whatsoever. And from a regulation point of view, it's quite interesting what we are experiencing in Mexico. There is an official decree in effect since April 2020 that put all immigration proceedings in a standby. No expiration date is running for temporary residents or permanent residents. But the National Migration Institute in Mexico is actually working. And Maria, my dear friend here from Mexico, will confirm this. In some of the offices of the National Immigration Institute, they are working better than ever. Of course, they have less work, so things are moving pretty fast right now in Mexico, even though officially everything is in a standby. Work permits are being issued, temporary residence permits are being issued and approved. So it's a kind of a limbo situation where, at least in theory, legally speaking, everything is in standby, but in reality, things are happening. The same thing with the Mexican consulates abroad. Depending on the situation of the pandemic situation, some of them have closed for a couple of months, sometimes weeks. And there was a period where they were actually closed for about, if I remember correctly, 3 months. All of them mandated by the headquarters in Mexico were closed, but then they just allow them to resume activities depending on the pandemic circumstances in each country and in each city where they are located. So as of today, with some limitations in terms of appointments and so on, but I would say that most Mexican consulates are now working for immigration proceedings. So that's the situation. At the airport, Maria and my other colleagues from Mexico, we have been advising all of you and our clients to be aware, because the airport scrutiny is tougher than it used to be before the pandemic. Again, I don't think that this is necessarily a reaction to the COVID situation. I think that the National Migration Institute just decided to be tougher on the revision of all those travelers coming into Mexico City's airport. And we have been experiencing many rejections that they do raise the issues of human rights protections, because when travelers are subject to this second interview, they have no access to any kind of representation, not even consular. They are isolated and incommunicated. Their cellular phones are retrieved from them. No due process, no translators. And sometimes they are subject and victims of criminal activities. They are robbed by the same authorities. They steal their money from their wallets and credit cards, subject to blackmail, corruption. So they are completely by themselves. And that's one of the issues that we are living and experiencing in Mexico in some of the airports, mostly in Mexico City. Some questions have been raised by, for example, Colombia. Ambassador Patricia Cárdenas visited the airport as a means to send a message that Colombia is not comfortable with the situation that Colombians are experiencing when entering into Mexico. So that's one thing that that we must analyze and see how we can solve and offer travelers more access to these basic fundamental rights. However, I must insist that this is not a reaction to COVID, because if all these questioning were because of finding out those suspicious cases of people coming from countries with a high peak of coronavirus, well, and I will explain this in a few minutes, the constitutional issues in Mexico, but probably that would be understandable from a constitutional point of view and from a reality point of view. However, they are not being questioned for health reasons. They are being questioned for any other reasons, the purpose of their trip, the means to finance their stay in Mexico, the activities that they will be performing, and so on. So this is not a COVID situation. Now, where we are standing, even though that we have no restrictions in Mexico, what if, let's make this exercise, because that's what UIA, Hervé, and Clayton are inviting us today to do. What if there were any restrictions caused by the pandemic? I want to take this idea from Marc-André, because it was interesting to compare, and this is again the beautiful exercise that we are doing today, comparing our legislation, our constitutions. Marc-André said that Canadians have the right to enter into Canada. All other citizens have, if I'm quoting you correctly, Marc-André, the privilege, meaning that, if I understand correctly, that can be rejected. In Mexico, everyone, all persons, all people, no matter whether they are Mexican or foreigners, have the right to enter and exit Mexico. And there are very few restrictions established in Article 11 of the Mexican Constitution. One of them is, of course, immigration rules, but the other one are those restrictions imposed by health laws. So when preparing the ideas for this panel, I thought, what if Mexico would have implemented the quarantine, the testing, or those limits to certain countries or people coming in from certain countries? In my opinion, I think it would be a valid restriction, a constitutionally valid restriction, since it is expressly stated in Article 11 that that Mexican authorities can implement those restrictions based on health issues. Of course, in a constitutional challenge, those decrees, those sanitary and health decrees would be looked into very carefully. Not all of them that were issued back in 2020 had all the formalities and sometimes the solemnities required by Mexican laws to be valid. So probably for reasons of not complying with the formalities, probably it could have been challenged if there were any restrictions. But if those restrictions were issued by the health authorities based on the health laws in effect in Mexico, I am of the opinion that those restrictions will be valid from a constitutional point of view. I was building, again, when thinking about this panel, because in Mexico we have now what is a very clear hierarchy of the laws of the Constitution. We have the Constitution on top of all the laws and regulation in Mexico, and then immediately below the Constitution, we have international treaties and federal laws. But at the same level now, treaties and federal laws. So even if what it means is that an international treaty cannot go and cannot violate the Mexican Constitution. So if the Constitution allows expressly to impose or implement these restrictions due to health issues, then again, I think that the legal and constitutional conclusion would be that those restrictions are valid. But I kept thinking, because Mexico 10 years ago started a new constitutional trend broadening the scope of fundamental rights and putting those fundamental rights and those human rights in the center of the analysis of each administrative, judicial, and even legislative resolution. So I started questioning whether we could build an argument that, even though, since the constitutional allows to impose those restrictions, but at the same time, some fundamental rights allow and force Mexican authorities to favor the respect of those fundamental rights, whether in this conflict or in this clash of two constitutional rights, the fundamental rights argument would prevail over the health restriction, which is again at the constitutional level. And the case that I was thinking is, what would happen if we had had this family stranded somewhere in the world, and the health regulation, as Marc-André explained to us, would not allow that family reunification, whether an argument could be built to force the Mexican authorities to issue an authorization for that family to travel. I don't know. It's an interesting argument that UIA, Hervé, and Clayton made me think about it. But and honestly, I don't know how it would be. It would not be a fast or easy case. It would take years. And when finally the Supreme Court would address this issue, the pandemic will be in the books, and hopefully we have learned from it. So that's the lab test that I did. From a constitutional point of view, keeping in mind, and again, I want to finish this with this idea that, again, Mexico has no restriction, did not have any restriction, and very likely will not have any restriction that force us to challenge this from a constitutional point of view. So that's my contribution, Hervé and Clayton. Thank you very much for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Marc-André. I just wanted to mention here just briefly, we appreciate you.
Adrian.
I'm sorry, Adrian. Sorry, my apologies here. My screen went kind of funny here for a second. So Adrian, my apologies. But my friend, your lab testing is important, because I think it's from a standpoint of here, we're all practicing international law. And so we look at these issues, and just because under the current political regime, you won't have restrictions, nothing to say what could happen. I mean, we've seen, large shifts in political spectrums in the United States over the past, 2 election cycles here. And so we always keep that in mind of certainly using forums like this as labs to test out ideas, so that we are able to respond accordingly to ideas. It's interesting because I think Ellen will mention this on the US side about consular processing, but the fact that consular processing in Mexico is going faster, Adrian, right? Or seems to be going faster, whereas in the States, I think we've had repatriation of staff, and then sending staff back out. So we've had that logistical issue. But in Mexico, it seems to be working the opposite here, that the consulates seem to be functioning more efficiently. Is that a fair statement?
Let me clarify. Not the U.S. consulate. I don't know about the U.S.
No, not the U.S. consulates, but the Mexican consulates.
The Mexican the authorities, the immigration authorities, are working better because they're receiving, at least in theory, less applications. What it's going to be a challenge and interesting, and Maria and I have discussed it within other associations, is what's going to happen when this standby is lifted, and all people that have been holding the renewals of their permits, their work applications, how they will handle then all the applications at the same time. And what I'm fearing is that, very Mexican style, one day we will wake up seeing the official bulletin that the standby decree is over, with no specific rules how it will apply. So the question we'll raise is, my FM3 expired in May 2021. I was under the umbrella of this standby decree. How many days, hours, or seconds I have to apply for the renewal, or am I losing all the accumulated time that I had in Mexico? I'm very sure that that's the way it's going to be. So the bottom line, and I think Maria and I would agree that that's our recommendation to all of you, so that you can transfer to your clients that have some people or some employees in Mexico, is do not wait until the decree is over to process, because immigration is working. The immigration authorities are working. Let's do it right now and not wait until the decree is over.
I'll just make one quick follow-up comment here, not for response, but thank you for mentioning right to counsel, because that's the theme of our commission meeting in Madrid. And so, which yeah, indeed. So we'll discuss that at our business meeting, but thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I have a question, which will be, I think, a good transition with Ellen's presentation from the US side. As you know, there's a travel ban to fly from a number of countries to the US, including most Schengen countries, now Brazil, South Africa, India, China, Iran, UK, and Ireland. And a lot of these people who are coming from these countries are using Mexico as a transit point to spend the 14 days before flying directly to the US. So we see a lot of Europeans, especially going to vacation in Cancun or wherever before flying to the US. And it's been going pretty much okay. I mean, there was no restrictions, probably because Mexico has a very lenient policy towards this, and there's no restrictions upon entry. Was there any discussion, as you know, in the Mexican government or between the Mexican and the US government regarding this, or it was just letting the free flow as it happened?
They just let it flow as it happened, and we actually use it, and with some of our friends here, including Ellen, and I think this is, I think Ellen goes after me, so this is a good introduction to Ellen presentation, because yes, we have received many questions during this year and a half whether we could use Mexico to travel to the US. Some of the clients and their advisors were conservative, saying, okay, I want them to do the quarantine in Mexico and then travel to the US. But some of them were more aggressive, saying, well, what if they land in Mexico City and then take a plane and go directly to Houston? Which from a Mexican perspective, it is and it was valid, no restriction whatsoever. We discussed in another panel whether it was ethical to do that and to advise our clients, and concluded, that was my conclusion, and ethical issues are very sometimes not black and white, but we concluded in the panel that it was ethical also to advise and provide information to the clients to make that decision, because at that point we were not violating any Mexican law, and seems like not even a US law. And with that, I think I will pass over to Ellen to tell.
Yeah, indeed, because well, obviously, and then we'll pass on the floor to Ellen, because if you do this within the 15-day period and you have a Mexican entry stamp, which is not 15 days old or 14 days old, then the US authorities will notice upon entry, and they have access to your flight records anyway, so it could be a problem. I mean, usually that's what we recommend to our clients as well, is using either Mexico or the Caribbean as a transit point, which makes more sense because Canada is not available for the reasons that Marc-André discussed earlier.
Right.
So, but it's an interesting question. Are there any other questions for Adrian?
Can I ask a quick question? Thank you, Adrian. That was really fascinating. I noticed that you said that, I think you said there had been about 230,000 deaths in Mexico related to COVID. Was that right? And it just struck me that I don't know what the population of Mexico is, so I'm not quite clear what that is in terms of context. But more than that, you talked about a very sort of light touch, quite liberal approach to controlling the pandemic. And I just wondered how that was playing politically in Mexico, whether there is public consent for that, or whether there's pushback against that approach.
Thank you, Ben. I always try to shut my political mouth, but the questions like this allow me to enter into those arenas. We have a population of 126 million people. So even though we are the fourth country with the greatest number of deaths, in a pro ratio, we are down to the 10th place or 11th place. So it's still pretty bad, but not as bad.
It's not as bad. No, no. But that's a whole discussion about whether the list should be updated as per the health situation in each country, in the US at least, because that's been the big discussion now.
But to answer your question, yes, the use of the pandemic, well, the federal government, specifically President López Obrador, which is a great politician. I do not agree with him in many things, but he's a great politician. He has been using the pandemic for political purposes in terms of the vaccination. So he has been delivering the vaccination with a specific political purpose. And then we have a lighting system for a health lighting system, red, where you have to stop all commercial activities, all social activities, yellow, orange, yellow, and green. Magically, last weekend or the previous weekend that we had federal elections all over the country, the largest voting ever in Mexico's history, all of a sudden, many of the states went down to green, all of a sudden. So the message received by the population is, wow, López Obrador and President and Morena party is doing great with the pandemic. We are all in green, we can go and party, restaurants. So everybody, we were all happy. 3 days after the election, you know what? We have to go back to yellow because it's coming up. So that's the thing of things that they're being implemented by the federal government and putting a lot of lives at risk because they just lower to green, expose people to the virus, and then return it to yellow once the election was over. So that's the use that they have been doing, and that many people, including me, are pointing a finger to the president and the health authorities in Mexico.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. If there are no more questions, we'll move on to Ellen's presentation. Ellen, the floor is yours, and it's
thank you, Hervé.
11, almost 11. Perfect. So we're good on time.
Thank you so much to the UIA. I'm so glad to be speaking for the first time with the organization of French international attorneys, and studied French in middle school. I don't remember very much of it, but love Paris and really interested in joining the organization. It's really nice to see such an intimate and small group of friends here. And I have to say a special thank you to Clayton for including me in the organization and giving me this opportunity. And of course, enormous thanks to my great friend, Adrian. I wish I had you as a professor in law school. I can listen to you for hours. I think I have to tell you honestly, just so you know, I am friends with a lot of international immigration lawyers. I work with a lot of them on mutual cases. You're the only one who made me really understand the Mexican immigration system. I understand what's going on. I understand what you're telling, and you're just very effective speaker and very effective attorney. And thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. So the US. And a lot of you, Hervé just demonstrated his, excellent knowledge of the current immigration restrictions in the United States. So I know most of you know what's going on in the United States. I don't want to bore you too much. But as you recognize, the United States took sort of a middle approach between Canada, Singapore, Australia, or Hong Kong, and Mexico that remained open. And it has been a very interesting year of watching the United States. You hear my accent, so I might as well say it up front. I grew up in the Soviet Union. I grew up in a country that's, encouraged politicians such as, Trump, Luis Obrador, or the president of Brazil. I'm very distrustful of the government system because I, grew up knowing that the truth was not what the government was telling people necessarily. And I'm still, after 30 years in the United States, fascinated by the dichotomy between the federal and state rights. Because in the United States, this pandemic, especially this restriction, showed how different we treat our citizens and how they can be treated differently, even within specific states. So first of all, to understand the United States perspective, you have to think about the United States Constitution, the separation from the UK, what the founders really wanted to find, and the personal freedom. United States is one of the very few countries in the world that created the concept of privacy and personal rights, and they're incredibly important to people. Unfortunately, during this pandemic, the personal rights have been hijacked, by the Trump supporters and the Trump's party to say that we are not going to listen to the government restrictions. We don't believe in science. We're not as well educated. We are not promoting scientists. We sort of put this one face of Dr. Fauci on TV, and it has been controversial as to whether we believe what he was saying or don't believe, but we believe politicians who speak to us, who have an enormous ear of people through social media, Fox News, and so forth. And so the health restrictions such as masks, or even now vaccination, became a political issue. So if you are a Democrat and you are on the left, you were wearing your mask or may still be wearing your mask in some places, and you are vaccinated. And if you don't believe necessarily in science, or you believe in the fact that your personal rights, just like the right to carry arms, right, is more important to you, then you bought arms during the pandemics. The United States experienced an enormous increase in sales of firearms during the pandemic, even though we did not necessarily experience a proportionate increase in crime, especially in the suburban areas or like wealthy areas where most of those firearms are being bought. There is statistical data that says that some Americans own as many as 40 to 60 guns, and a lot of them are military style assault weapons because we don't have any ban on that. So we're completely, in a different territory. The vaccination, despite the wide availability of the best vaccinations in the world, our vaccination rates are not really that great. So as you see in my background, that's the city where I live. It's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, very blue-collar town founded on steel mills and coal production by, the former kind of Facebook and Googles of the world, US Steel, and so forth. So here, it's because it's blue collar, it's unionized, so our vaccination rates are pretty good. But if you go in, even in a place like Missouri, which is Midwest, not necessarily South, the vaccination rates are one of the lowest in the country. And it's like a huge shift in the country where the Midwest and the South are going different in their political opinions, and it's reflected in the vaccination rate. So you have to look at that. Same thing is happening with the masks. Most of the states are dropping the mask mandates. If you go today out in a city, you are going to see very, very few masks. And most of the people, if they're wearing them, you become now very concerned and aware because you think, well, these are the people who are not vaccinated because they're required to wear masks. So you're not necessarily perceiving them as having a health issue and wearing a mask because they're still believing that the vaccination rates are not where they need to be, but rather you're thinking these are the anti-vaxxers. So there is like a huge political divide in the society that was created by this pandemic. Of the mistrust of one another, of the further kind of isolation that we stick together in very small groups. And we're only talking to people who are like us, and we are not really reaching across the divide. So that's like kind of general situation in the country for you to understand where we are. But then again, you're looking at us, we're here in the United States, you're looking at us from the outside, and we came out of this pandemic in a way right now as the shining beacon on the hill, because guess what? We have the most vaccines. We in fact have so many vaccines that we're now finally giving them to the rest of the world, and we're being kind and we're trading them. We're using them as a most important currency. So if we want to have an agreement with Luis Obrador on containing the southern border, not having any more caravans, on keeping the asylum seekers or people who want to come and work in the United States. We don't want them here. We want like a flow of migration, controlled flow of migration. We just traded it for the vaccines. And we're going to trade it more for the vaccines around the world, because we're the ones who are manufacturing them and have the most of them. We'll give some to Canada, as we feel that we need Trudeau to reopen the border a little more, but we don't really care that much about Canada, so we're not giving them as much. It's very, very political, and you feel it every day. And then there is a discrimination kind of process that's happening about the vaccine. So the private enterprises can now mandate what they wish, right? And so for the first time, starting last week, there has been a limited ruling by our Department of Labor that said the employers are finally allowed to ask workers whether they have been vaccinated. Because if you're a private enterprise, you don't really want to reopen your office without people confirming that they have been vaccinated. And yet we have this huge privacy rights in the United States that says you as an employer cannot ask to see the vaccination card. We don't have vaccine passports and not about to implement them when we're subject to cybersecurity attacks every day, and we're so concerned that this information will be hacked as well. So the fact that the employer can now ask for the proof of vaccination is huge. As an owner of a law firm, I can tell you that it makes a huge difference for me, because I feel comfortable with the people that will be in the office. Now, if you go to a government office, such as our immigration service, you may still be required to wear a mask. And if you come to any healthcare facility or a large law, even a small law firm, they will take your temperature. So again, private enterprise is allowed to violate your privacy rights and impose their own requirements upon you. But the Americans are very concerned, like who is going to ask them what kind of questions? Do they have to answer those questions? Do they have to get the vaccines? And then a very interesting, going into the actual immigration here, who has the right? Who does our Constitution protect? And as an immigration lawyer for over 20 years, almost every day, every other day, I don't represent a lot of individuals. I represent employers like most of you. But when we represent even the employers, we get asked a question about whether somebody should apply for citizenship. And many people would like to have United States citizenship because they can sponsor their parents. They want to vote in the election. I think somebody like Trump really triggered people to go apply for citizenship, whether because they wanted their rights protected or whether because they wanted to vote in the next election and make sure something like that doesn't happen again. But generally, as an immigration lawyer, if somebody asks you about United States citizenship versus legal permanent residence, or what everybody knows as the green card, there are not that many differences, right? Well, you can vote. You can't vote without US citizenship. You can't sponsor your parents or siblings without it, but that's, pretty minor issue. You cannot be covered by subsidized healthcare insurance such as Medicaid and Medicare. So for older people, it's important. If you're a very high net worth individual, it makes sense for you to become a US citizen because your estate taxes will be significantly lower. Again, applies to a very small group of individuals. But look at what's happening during the pandemic. We're really not giving any rights to foreign nationals in the United States. We have been one of the most inhumane countries when it came to the pandemic and foreign nationals who were living in the United States. It was really painful to see that we did not afford any automatic immigration status or extensions or, this liberal rights, like what Adrian was discussing was happening in Mexico. We had none of it, none of it. And so despite the fact that our immigration services completely went to work at home, despite the fact that our Department of State employees all returned back into the United States, we hardly made any adjustments for the foreign nationals. We definitely showed them we don't really care about them. We have this perception that we are a shining beacon on the hill. All of you want to come here. So, figure out your immigration status, figure out what you need to do to survive in this environment. And we don't care that you're going to wait for 2 years to come to the United States because the consular services are closed. We don't care that you have to stop working because your employment authorization extension is taking 15 months. I mean, these are unbelievable processing times. The government used to have 90 days mandates to process certain documents. They got rid of any kind of mandate. And the minute they talk about that they need more staff to provide the services, right away, the head of the Homeland Security at the AILA meeting last week, at our annual meeting, said that they're going to increase the filing fees. And the filing fees in the United States are pretty steep. I mean, I don't want to say that no other country has high filing fees. Australia does too, and there may be some other countries. But generally, I would say overall, the filing fees are now double my fees. Like, I sit around and start thinking, I think I need to raise my fees. I think they look like so disproportionate to the filing fees that the immigration service is taking, and the clients expect me to do the work as fast as a machine. You know, there has to be, like, you know, some proportionality here. So it's an interesting concept that also emerged during this pandemic. And I also wanted to say about the discriminatory approach to foreign nationals with respect to the vaccine. I don't know if any of you pays attention, but you know, our authorities, and we'll talk about it, how they announced like the priorities on immigration, but they said, you know, there is a huge lobby by academia, by our educational institutions. I don't know if any of you pays attention, but the United States has 3,500 universities and colleges. That's a huge number, 3,500. And a lot of them, you know, have thousands of students. And a lot of them survive based on foreign students because they pay full tuition, as opposed to American students that get some scholarships and breaks, or, you know, their families can pay. So there are some government subsidies that may be available to some of them. So a lot of those universities are consolidating, closing, because they really can't survive without foreign students. So one of the objectives that was imposed by the Department of State on whose visa is going to get the priority is foreign students. Finally, the consulate said, foreign students, come on in, you're going to come. The universities can impose the vaccine mandate. They don't want their student population and professors getting sick. They said, so most of the universities are issuing private kind of employer mandate saying you will have to be vaccinated to come on campus. Guess what? They're not accepting even AstraZeneca in some instances, let alone the Russian vaccine Sputnik or the Chinese vaccine. They're only accepting Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna. So a lot of those students will have to get revaccinated in the United States. And, you know, it's like two-step process, and you have to have a 2 weeks, 14 days after the second dosage. So the students really need to come early in order to get this vaccination done and be allowed to attend classes in person. Similarly, Broadway shows are reopening. You can go see Bruce Springsteen on Broadway with AstraZeneca. So too bad, UK citizens, or, you know, permanent residents who got their vaccine done when they were in Europe. You can't even go see a Broadway show unless you have the vaccine that's mandated by the United States. Talk about the, you know, personal rights and what happens with that. So here, you know, again, the approach that we know better, and we're going to mandate our rules to you, and you better live up to it. Was the permanent residents who couldn't come back to the United States, because, well, let's think about Australia. You're a permanent resident of the United States, Australian citizen, you're stuck there, you can't leave. And you may be missing, you know, you may be perceived as abandoning your permanent resident status. So you will have to affirmatively make an argument at the border when you present yourself that you haven't abandoned your permanent resident status because you couldn't come back into the country. And the Customs and Border Protection, the branch of our Department of Homeland Security that deals with admissions, said, we will listen to your argument, but you will have to document it in detail. You will have to bring actually, you know, proof of either articles or national proclamations that were issued that saying that your borders were closed and you were stuck. Same thing will happen with China. China has a lot of United States permanent residents or other citizens who are permanent residents of the United States and were sent on assignment to China. I deal with it on a daily basis. All of them are stuck there. They can't leave. They can't come back because China is one of the countries on a travel ban list, even though, you know, it's not health mandated. It's just like with Mexico. It's completely politically mandated. China has very low COVID rates and very low death rates, at least based on what we know around the world, but yet they're on a travel ban list. And so those permanent residents will definitely have significant issues trying to come back into the country. But the main thing I think that bothered me so much, being an immigration lawyer and practicing for the last, you know, year and a half, and giving me like a form of PTSD, you know, disorder dealing with that, is the fact of how inhumane we are. We did not even pass the Healthcare Worker Act, despite the fact that 30% of American physicians are foreign born and foreign educated physicians, and a lot of the times they just did the residency and fellowship, sort of this postgraduate training in the United States, but they completed medical school outside of the United States. We did not you know, give them permanent resident status. We did not put them ahead of line. Same thing with registered nurses. We read weekly articles in New York Times about medical doctors who sacrificed their lives. We're really working at the forefront, where the, you know, the frontline workers, what we call, and yet they were not giving any special benefits. The minor concessions that our government made, if you can really look at it as concessions, is the fact that they started accepting a copy of the original signature. And it's also quite funny because they don't accept, you know, DocuSign. They don't accept electronic signature that is accepted around the world as the double proof that this is actually original signature because of all the authentication that goes into a DocuSign. So that's not accepted. So if you use DocuSign to sign an immigration form, guess what? It will be returned back to you, maybe a month later, maybe 2 months later, depending on how our postal service works. It finally works better, I have to tell you. I'm finally getting mail in a more timely manner. But during the Trump administration, because they were trying to deal with the mail-in ballots and change the way our mail service works, it was taking months and many months sometimes to get even acknowledgement from the immigration service. So again, a copy of the original signatures. The Department of Labor that issues our determination for the labor market test, it's the same one in Canada, the LMIA, so we have a very similar labor market test. Except it's now taking 13 months as opposed to 28 days in Canada. So that used to come on the original paper, and it was blue in color, and it looked like something significant in 20 pages. So during the pandemic, the Department of Labor started sending it electronically. And again, at the American Immigration Lawyers Association annual meeting on the Department of Labor forum, they announced that from now on, they'll always have it electronically. So these are one of the concessions, if you want to say what are the permanent changes that happened in the United States in immigration system as a result of the pandemic. Well, hallelujah, we have one department issuing some form electronically, and maybe copies of the signatures will remain for a while with the immigration service, but again, only with the immigration service. So if you are presenting your documentation under what used to be called NAFTA, now United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, and you are applying for it through the border clearance at the Canadian airport, like Montreal, for example, it is absolutely unclear whether they will accept a copy of the signature. So I'm still killing trees, sending lots of FedExes around the world, because I'm not sure that a blanket L submission to a consulate will be accepted as a copy. With respect to the consulates, and that's another, like one of those game shows. So we know that under the Trump administration, because of two very different heads of the Department of State, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So one was Tillerson, and then the next one was Pompeo, the former head of the CIA, who were, you know, shooting from the hip, didn't really know what they were doing, never worked with the diplomatic corps. There was a mass resignation of American diplomats. The diplomats tend to be much more liberal, much more gay, much more apolitical, as the federal government employees should be. So they resigned en masse. And then the Trump administration had a hiring freeze. So we did not really prepare any new diplomatic corps. So we have a void, and we will have that void remaining for many years. A lot of the diplomats left and came back to the United States. There were rumors that a lot of them were living in the DC in hotels, waiting for their assignments that kind of never happened. Comes the new Secretary of the Department of State, Mr. Blinken, and allegedly makes some kind of deal with Biden and says, hey, I have no people to send. I have nobody to send at this point. So how about we are not reopening American consulates? How about we are not processing any visas? Again, shining beacon on the hill. That's like the theme of my presentation. It's a great privilege to come to the United States. And we don't care that you are not shopping here. We don't care that you are not in Disney World or Las Vegas. We're going to survive. With the, tourism is not a large portion of our economy. We're not Greece and we're not Italy. So it's okay for us to be without workers. And American businesses will outsource more. We also don't penalize them for outsourcing. So how about everything goes to Philippines and India? We don't care. That will be fine. And so in this sense, they're just continuing to suffocate American businesses. The businesses can survive just so long. Eventually, they start thinking, we really need these workers and we can't have everything done remotely. We are at the point where this economy is like at a breaking point because there are no workers, as you probably also hear in the newspapers, and there are no workers for a multitude of reasons. One that is blamed mainly again on Fox News is because the payouts during the pandemic for unemployment were significantly higher than the pay that the people were making, so they're not willing to come back into the workforce. But nobody talks about caregivers issues, the fact that the United States doesn't have a good system of the preschools. So they're so expensive that it doesn't make any sense to commute and go to work and pay for daycare when you can care for your own children. So we have a multitude of social issues in the society that are not necessarily being addressed. In the meantime, we really need immigrants. It's getting to the point that we can't live without a larger number of immigrants coming into the United States. The Immigration Subcommittee is having hearing today on comparing actually our system to the Canadian system and trying to figure out, should we finally make some kind of changes to encourage more immigrants? And Clayton pointed out to me that I'm out of town. So I'm going to wrap up. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It was very, very interesting and a very interesting perspective. So, I mean, I'm a US immigration lawyer, although I'm French, but I'm based in New York and practice immigration law. I just wanted to pick your brain on, I do a lot of E2 visas, which are, as you know, treaty-based visas between I'm just saying this for the other attendees, between the US and a certain number of countries. A lot of them are being European or developed countries mainly. And these treaties basically are, investment or trade treaties, which are supposed to be mutually beneficial to both parties. And this are also stopped in the main immigration conundrum that we have with visa issuance, etc. Although it's not as bad as other visas like Ls or H-1Bs. Is there any argument that we could make that, there's a violation of some international law because the US is not respecting or abiding by the treaties that they signed with the other parties by not granting E2 visas, for instance? I mean, it's one way of throwing things out in line with what you just said, like, the US is the beacon and then, they do whatever they want.
Yeah. So the foreign direct investment is not one of the government priorities. I really didn't have much time to explain, but under Trump and all this, there were bans on specific visa categories like H&L, then there were bans on specific countries, right? And the Republican administration is always much more pro-business, much more, for big money. So they at least had some reasonable number of exceptions to those travel bans that allowed random people to come into the country. We're pretty much as open as Mexico, because as long as you can have a good immigration lawyer, and I can make a strong argument that there is a national exception associated with your physical presence in the United States, welcome in and no quarantine. You go right into the society. A private company can impose a quarantine and say, if you traveled within the past 14 days, you can't show up in the office, but you can go work from a hotel. The immigration service is not going to conduct your interview if you traveled within the past 14 days. You have to change your interview, but everything else is fine. With the e-visas, they decided that, and I have to tell you, I have a $50 billion French company. For whatever reason, they didn't have the e-registration. I applied for their registration 5 months ago. You would think that $50 billion company, they should at least look at those documents. They keep canceling my foreign national appointment. He is not a high-level executive. I think maybe if he was, if I traded him for, a really high-level executive, maybe they would have given me an appointment under the new criteria, but otherwise they can canceling. Adrian and I are working on a case of a Colombian citizen, and 2 days ago I had a light bulb, and I thought, oh, what if I just create a consulting company for him and I can bring him as an E2. Bogota is not taking any visa appointments, and they're not on a travel ban list. It's a governmental ban on issuance of visas. They decided that let's all the Americans come around, spread that COVID, but we're just going to keep the foreign nationals out. It's again, the same approach. You are not equal to us. It's a great privilege to come to this country, and let us show you, who is the boss.
It's true. It's true.
We have a couple.
Question there on the vice president visiting southern border. It's a completely political issue. She has nothing to do with the border. She doesn't know much about immigration. I mean, she may a little bit because her mother and father were immigrants. She's a daughter of immigrants, but nevertheless, the southern border is a huge issue of gangs, coyotes, of, us not being willing to create, a visa that was similar to Braceras. Was it like in 1940s? When we just need temporary workers, give people a right to come, work, go back home. That's how it's always worked. But, in reality, because there hasn't been an immigration reform since 1996, and that the last amnesty that we had expired on April 30th, 2001, that's over 20 years ago. So because of this inability of our immigration system to move at least a little bit with times, we're just having a system that's exploding. In the United States, everything is a very, very big pendulum. It has to go to a certain extreme, to an extreme, and then it comes down. So hopefully if the infrastructure bill goes by, and maybe something will happen with the filibuster, which is not clear, but maybe we'll have some kind of immigration reform in a few years. We'll see, depending on the elections in November.
Yes, because I mean, one would think that before, when Trump was president, that it was a complete mess for immigration, and everybody thought, okay, Trump is gone, it's going to get much better with Biden, etc. But it's actually quite the opposite.
Exactly.
With the COVID being used as an excuse almost.
Just like in any other country.
Yeah, exactly. So this is where we are.
There's a question in the chat box from Adrian as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's asking whether.
Let me read the question so that everybody. So, question for Ellen: U.S. immigration consular practices are likely to violate the USMCA obligations to facilitate entrance of business visitors. Consulates are granting appointments to obtain a B1 visa for late 2022, which is crazy. Would that be a valid argument at a consular level to try to obtain an emergency appointment, or the argument could backfire the applicant?
So there is no backfire. They created a pretty complex approach, Adrian, of what you have to do. You have to ask for an emergency appointment, and you have to make an argument on the national interest exception. So even though it's two separate concepts, they're married together. If you are not eligible for the national interest exception, you are not eligible for the emergency appointment. The national interest exception includes humanitarian reasons. So if you give an example that you are the only living relative of somebody on life support in the United States or dying, or you need to go to a funeral or to bury a body or to sign, life directive, you can come because that's the level of the humanitarian need that they see, right? If you can demonstrate that this particular company will have to shut down shut down the line of the manufacturing because these Mexican engineers cannot come, that meets the national interest exception and gives you emergency appointment. So once you meet the national interest exception, you get the emergency appointment. If you get the emergency appointment, it's not 100% guarantee that the national interest exception will be granted, but it's about 90%, maybe even 95.
No. And talking about humanitarian reason, I mean, we also have another very difficult situation where people who live in the US on the work visas have to go back to their home countries for humanitarian reason because they have an ailing parent who's dying, etc. But then when they want to come back, that's not a humanitarian reason because they left the country on their own will. And then everything starts.
That we don't care. I have a PTSD. People always ask, who are the majority of your clients? And regardless where you are in the United States, the majority of your clients will always be Indian nationals because it's the largest immigrant population in the United States and because there are a billion of them, right? How do you think you can survive, without like counseling? I feel as an immigration lawyer, when I have those crying Indian professionals calling me that their father is on life support, they have to go to India to do the last rites. They have to go to say goodbye. And I'm like, and I don't know when I can bring you back. I just don't know when I can bring you back. I filed an extension of status for an Indian citizen who were running out of his immigration status because he was waiting for the certain steps of the green cards to be approved, to be eligible to extend the H-1B visa. I had 1 day break. I had an excellent petition. The person worked for the company. The company distributes COVID vaccines. The immigration service denied the extension of stay because of the 1 day break. That's how inhuman they are. And the whole family went back to India, and without waiting for my advice, they left before getting the vaccination. Every week, I'm like, okay, Kieran, how are things? I feel like I'm like this, fairy godmother. I just keep checking with them because I feel so bad that they're in India, and I keep checking when I can bring them back. And if you fight really, really hard, if you devote 40 hours of your time to something like that, you can get them the appointments, you can get them back. But the level of the concierge service that it requires is beyond somebody who represents high volume immigration cases. So as of today, I hired 7 more people because you just
no, it's true. But unfortunately, it takes a lot more time, and clients always don't understand that we have to increase our fees because it takes more time to process things just because it's nobody's fault. Well, it's the US government, that's the way it is. Any more questions for Alan? Okay, we are very good on time so far, and I want to move on to our last speaker of the day, Matthew Wills from the UK, and then we'll have hopefully another 30 minutes to discuss among ourselves, and maybe we can discuss more topics regarding how the US government is behaving. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hervé, and I'll try not to get quite as furious with the UK government as you and Ellen clearly are with the US government at the moment. So look, from the UK perspective, I think very much like the jurisdictions that the majority of you will practice in, we essentially faced 2 main challenges in March last year as the severity of the pandemic began to gradually emerge. Firstly, our absolute inability to maintain the mechanisms of making a UK immigration application, whether that's from in-country or from outside the UK. And secondly, the inability of individuals who would otherwise have been required to depart the UK to actually make that trip due to international travel restrictions. So I'll focus on the first point at the outset. As again, maybe the case for many of you guys, the majority of immigration routes for the UK requires the enrollment of biometric information. This is done at an enrollment centre operated by a third-party provider. And as the UK and I think the majority of other countries worldwide went into lockdown in March, the inability of applicants to attend these centres meant that although there was no suspension of immigration services, the ability to submit an immigration application online maintained as it has ever been. The Home Office's procedures at the time were not designed for an application process which did not involve, at least at some stage in the process, some element of person-to-person contact, which meant that from March, I think probably until the summer, from what I recall, there was no ability for an immigration application to be submitted, processed, and a decision made on it. Now, I think probably since September, October, the majority of centres for biometric enrolment are again open in the UK with very limited exceptions, and again also overseas, again with very limited exceptions. And indeed, concessions permit that where centres are closed due to COVID, individuals can actually apply to from any other country that they can access. What, however, I think is interesting, we can take away from this complete spanner in the works of the way that UK immigration applications work, is the potential impact that this disruption may have going forward. Laura and Ben on the call may recall that for a very limited period of time over the summer, an app was made available for the submission of in-country applications from within the UK to facilitate biometric enrolment in the same way that we have for the EU settlement scheme, which I've bored you all to death with over the last few years. Now that's been actually expanded. It's no longer predominantly in place for applications made from within the UK, but it has been expanded for certain sorts of applications made from within the EU, which I think is potentially indicative that a revised contactless process for visa applications may be more widely introduced in the coming years. On the second point, the Home Office has also introduced a variety of concessions to cater for those in the UK who would normally be required to depart, either to get their new immigration permission or because their immigration permission was coming to an end. And those concessions, I think, probably are slightly more generous than certainly what Ellen's been setting out in respect of the lack of flexibility of the US government. The initial concession, interestingly, unilaterally conferred leave in the UK up until the 31st of March last year, but exclusively to Chinese nationals. That's how restrictive it was at the outset, whose visas expired between January and the end of March of that year. But then subsequently, the concession was updated in increments. So it was updated to cover all nationalities on the 24th of March. And then subsequently, people in the UK on an expiring visa were able to have it extended to the 31st of May, and then to the 31st of July, and then to the 31st of August. So you can see the steps that the UK government took. And I would argue that this doesn't just extend to immigration, were fairly short term in their approach, and also changes announced comparatively last minute. It's no longer actually possible to simply request an extension of your visa on the basis of COVID-19 and international travel restrictions. However, there's been something introduced called exceptional assurance. And if you ask me precisely what it is, it's a very difficult answer to give to you. I'm not entirely sure. Essentially, exceptional assurance is something that those who have leave that expires by the 30th of June can apply for, and it grants them additional time to stay, but it is a weaker form of any sort of concession than an outright visa extension. Our understanding is it essentially acts as a short-term protection against adverse action or consequence after immigration permission has expired, and facilitates the extension of the conditions of that leave granted. So it is a temporary protection, but it is not an issuance of UK immigration status, even though you can actually switch back into UK immigration status on the basis of the current concession. As I mentioned, this concession comes to an end on the 30th of June. Signals appear to indicate that it will be further extended in some form, but with 6 days to go, we are still yet to receive any sort of further update in that respect, as of half an hour ago or so. A couple of other points that have, I think, developed over the course of the last 15 months that I think are worth highlighting to you. Ellen spoke in some depth about the lack of flexibility that the US has taken to immigration issues. And I think it's fair to say that the UK, although I've obviously expressed some concern with the approach that the government has taken, has demonstrated a little more flexibility. And there's, I think, two particular changes that I would highlight to you. Firstly, historically, for certain immigration categories, it has not been possible to make the application from within the UK. And typically this is for young people, working holiday makers, things like that. They've been required to return to their country of origin, make the application from that country, and then return back to the UK. It's a procedural nonsense. It's no longer as prevalent as of the 1st of December last year. But there has been a concession in place for much of the pandemic and remains in place to enable those who have an immigration permission expiring ahead of the 1st of July to switch from their immigration permission from within the UK when the immigration rules would not otherwise permit to do so. The second concession I think is worth highlighting relates to income. There are certain immigration categories, notably the spousal route, whereby applicants have to demonstrate that they have earned a particular amount of money over a particular period of time. Naturally, individuals have been placed on furlough. They have had their earning potential disrupted over this period of time. And as a result, and I think appropriately so, the government has introduced certain concessions to certain categories, allowing for some alleviation, allowing for some generosity in the approach that is taken. So, as I said, that does indicate some difference between the approach that the UK and the US governments appear to have taken from Ellen's presentation. The final point that I would make relates to travel restrictions. Marc-André and Adrian in particular spoke in some depth about the restrictions, or in the case of Mexico, the apparent lack of restrictions on individuals being able to enter the UK, being able to enter those countries. In respect of the UK, the position has changed with a degree of regularity. There was, for example, a period of time up until I think the 17th of May, whereby you needed a legally permitting reason to actually leave the UK, let alone enter it. But currently we are operating what is referred to as a traffic light system. If you are entering the UK and you've been in a red list country for within the 10 days prior to your entry to the UK, you have to do certain things. Firstly, you can only enter the UK if either you are a British citizen or you have pre-existing residence rights, i.e. you have a visa other than a visit visa. Secondly, you are required to quarantine in a government-managed quarantine hotel for a period of 10 days upon entry to the UK, for the not insignificant sum of, I think, £1,750 per individual. You are also required to complete a passenger locator form, telling essentially the authorities where you will be, take a COVID test within 72 hours of travel to the UK, and take pre-arranged COVID tests on days 2 and 8 of your entry to the UK. So fairly draconian, serious provisions. And that relates typically to travelers from, I think, South Africa, the UAE, and the vast majority of, if not all, of South America. The next list down is the amber list, and that applies to the majority of countries worldwide. Essentially, it is not dissimilar to the restrictions for those entering from red list countries. The two differences being, one, you do not require British citizenship or prior residence rights to be able to enter the UK. Secondly, you are permitted to self-isolate in a private accommodation. And thirdly, you can look to take advantage of something called a test to release scheme, whereby if you register a negative COVID test after 5 days, you can be released, if you will, from your self-isolation period as soon as you've got that result, which should typically be 6 days after entry to the UK. The final batch of countries, and I suppose the gold standard, there is an awful lot of disquiet as Portugal is no longer on this list, and therefore European holidays are pretty much out for the time being, is the green list. Essentially, with the green list, yes, you are required to take a test in advance of travel. You are required to form, but you do not have to self-isolate upon entry to the UK, and you only test on day 2 of entry. At the moment, countries on the green list include, I believe, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland. But given what I understand to be fairly challenging procedures for anybody entering, particularly Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, I don't really think that those sorts of concessions necessarily facilitate foreign travel with great ease. I think that just about covers the main points that I wanted to make. I'm quite conscious of time, but I'm obviously very happy to take any questions that any of you may have. And if I don't know the answers, I will simply refer you to Laura or Ben.
So Matthew, do you think there's a client perception? I mean, you said that really COVID, the use of COVID, the pandemic as a reason in front of the home office for relief is going away or has gone away. Do you think your clients still think it's there? Is there a perception issue that's there? Because I'm finding there's a perception issue with my clients here. The U.S. had limited COVID relief on the immigration tax side for 60 days last year, and that was gone. But my clients still think that COVID can be used as an excuse. And I don't mean that like in a nefarious way. They just think, oh, it's still a pandemic, and so of course they're going to give me relief. Do you see that misconception or disconnect as well?
I don't think so. Certainly from my experience, I think potentially the reason for that might be, thinking on my feet here, is that, as I mentioned earlier, the UK government's concessions have been extremely short in the time limits they have covered, albeit with subsequent extensions. So every time somebody gets some sort of immigration permission or extension or exceptional assurance based on the current circumstances, they're typically only valid for a very, very limited period of time. We certainly have a perception issue in respect of the forthcoming deadline for applications under the EU settlement scheme, but I suspect that's a separate conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Maria has a question here that's like a general question.
From a labor perspective, is it going to be mandatory to have the vaccine? That's a question for everyone, actually. So, well, we could actually do a quick turn or a quick go around with starting with Marc-André for Canada, and then Adrian, Ellen, and Matthew. Just if you can have a short answer to that, that would be great. Thank you.
Of course. So as far as from a labor perspective in Canada, it would not be permissible to make the vaccine mandatory. And therefore, the position has been that it has to be a voluntary decision. However, obviously, the idea is also to make life significantly simpler for fully vaccinated individuals and workers.
Meaning that there will be like a sort of like undisclosed incentive to be vaccinated.
Correct.
Okay.
Mexico, China, I think that from an immigration point of view, I don't see them forcing to have the vaccination and implementing that policy to enter at this point. And from a labor perspective, that's an interesting one. Whether the government or even entities, a private entity, as Ellen was mentioning, can demand or force their employees to have that vaccination. I think my answer, subject to a further study and analysis, would be that it would not be valid to demand that, similarly to what Mark Andres just said. It would violate those privacy and private rights of employees. I would not be, I don't think it would be enforceable in Mexico.
So in the United States, whether it's enforceable or not, the private enterprises are all, asking for it. They're asking for it, right? So they created incentives. One of my close friends is an ophthalmologist. She has 12 people working for her. In the early days when the first vaccines got available to healthcare workers, she procured them, brought to the office. All 12 refused to get them. She offered $100, and for $100, all 12 agreed to have it. So that's a great picture for you into the American society. So last week, there was a well-publicized case in Houston where about 129 healthcare workers refused to have a vaccine and filed a lawsuit with the federal court that the hospital cannot mandate them to get a vaccine because it's poisonous to their body. The federal judge said it's BS and just threw the case out. Now, there are healthcare workers in the United States who are not vaccinated, and there is quite a large percentage of them. So if you look at the retirement home or the facility for elderly, the Jewish Healthcare Foundation here in Pittsburgh, I think they reported that 70% of their workers were vaccinated, and it exceeds any national rate. And I was so surprised that all these people, after witnessing all the elderly dying from COVID, still not willing to get the vaccination. So it's very much, again, here is the movement of privacy versus the rights. And there are all kinds of incentives that are happening around the country. You can win free donuts and free bagels and free trips. So the private enterprise is very much trying to encourage people to get vaccinated, but they feel that they're not doing enough of the national broadcasting and sort of the messaging explaining that the vaccine is not poisonous, that you are not going to be barren and not have children because you got the vaccine, that, it's not messing up with your DNA. So all the medical researchers are up in arms as to why people are not getting vaccinated, but they're not willing to go down to the level of less educated people and try to explain to them as to why there is no damage associated with the vaccine. So as of now, if you have a religious exception, which in the United States, 40% of population are evangelicals, 20% of them refuse to get vaccinations. So they can claim, like Jehovah's Witnesses don't get vaccines, but evangelicals generally do get vaccines. So unless you can express that for religious reasons, you don't get any vaccines, or you have health reasons, meaning that you don't have immune system, and then you're not working most likely anyway. Pretty much everybody should get vaccinated, but we're still not seeing the levels of the vaccine that need to be here to really reopen the economy fully.
Just wait. One quick comment here. I'm waiting for tax incentives to pop in. The next stimulus check that comes from the United States, vaccinated. Here or.
That will work right away.
Right. That would work. I think you give. I think Alan's right. You give someone a little bit of money in the United States, and boom, it happens. So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I just before Matthew actually gives his thoughts. We had a few. I do a lot of work with German clients as well, and in Germany, they will offer, or they will have, it's mandatory school and mandatory vaccines, and we have a few German citizens who formed groups to apply for political asylum to the US because on the basis that their kids would be obliged to be vaccinated in Germany so that they can be homeschooled in the US and not get the vaccines. So that's an interesting concept.
Right, but the federal government here takes a very pro-vaccine approach, right? So you wait until you go to the immigration service and you may be asked to present your vaccination card. And if you don't have a vaccination card, we may not want you at the immigration service, for example. So I think it's not like a ground under which you can, this membership in a political group, that's what you're presenting as an argument for the asylum here.
Yes.
I don't think that they will recognize it, the anti-vaxxers, as the political or, group that
I don't think so either, but for some reason, that's what they're trying to do, because I guess the US would be the only country which entertains such a thing for now. Matthew?
Well, it's an interesting question, and as you know, I'm no labor lawyer, but I cannot see any enthusiasm for mandating taking the vaccine, whether that be in an employment context or otherwise. My perception is that there is a distinct lack of enthusiasm, indeed some resistance towards vaccination passports, whether that's to facilitate international travel or access events such as concert, sporting events, that sort of thing, because the concern is that it creates some form of two-tier society. My personal view is that's all very well and good when a fairly significant portion of the population still have not received their second vaccine, but maybe the arguments start to become a little less compelling once individuals have been offered the vaccine, but due to their own individual concerns, have taken the view that they do not wish to take that. So I think from a kind of an employment and human resources perspective, the development of those arguments as workers potentially choose not to take the vaccine and therefore endanger the people that they're working with, it will be interesting to see how those arguments develop from an employment law perspective.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have
any other questions?
So if we don't, Hervé, we can leave it to you to close, and so that we can close the recording as well.
Yes, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank any of the four, I mean, all of you to have given excellent presentations today. We had a great discussion, but unfortunately, we need to keep the time. This seminar will be also sent to the UIA at large and will be available on their website. So I think it's a great material for our commission to have this available to the association at large. Thank you everyone for participating, and I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully in Madrid at the end of October for Congress. Thank you.